Hi, welcome back to your favorite show, The Genius Seat. நம்ம மதுரை காமராஜர் பல்கலையில் கடந்த ஜனவரி 8, 9, 10 இந்த 3 நாட்களுமே ரொம்ப அருமையான நாட்கள் என்றே சொல்லியாகணும். ஏன்னா இந்திய எக்கனாமெட்ரிக்ஸ் கழகம் சார்பில் 56வது மாநாடு ரொம்ப சிறப்பாக நடைபெற்றது. இதை நம்மளுக்காக தொகுத்து வழங்கினது யாருன்னா நம்ம பல்கலைக்கழகத்தோட பொருளாதாரத்துறை தான். அவங்களுக்கு இதற்காக பாராட்டுகள் மற்றும் வாழ்த்துக்களை தெரிவித்துக் கொள்வது மட்டுமல்லாமல் இந்த வாரம் உயர்திரு சக்கரவர்த்தி ரங்கராஜன் த ஃபார்மர் கவர்னர் ஆஃப் RBI அவங்களுடைய சிறப்புரையை பற்றி தான் பார்க்க போகிறோம். இந்த ஸ்பெஷல் ஜீனியஸ் சீட்டில் அவங்களுடைய சிறப்புரை இதோ உங்களுக்காக.
ப்ரொஃபஸர் பஞ்சமுகி, ராஜீவ் குமார் and friends, it's a great honor to be invited to deliver this year's Chakravarti Memorial Lecture. Professor Sukumar Chakravarti was one of India's outstanding economists. His main interest was in real growth and investment planning. He wrote extensively in these areas, and some of his writings are path-breaking. His interest in matters of money and finance were minimal. However, the position changed when he was appointed in 1982 to chair the committee to review the working of the monetary system. I was a member of the committee and worked closely with him. As you all know, the Chakravarti Committee recommended that money supply should be regulated, keeping in tune with expected real growth of the economy in order to ensure price stability. Even though the report reflected many of my thoughts, views that I have been expressing for a long time, it had the imprint of Professor Chakravarti. It was not a passive endorsement of the recommendations of the committee, but a positive one, having spoken on several occasions emphasizing the significance of the recommendations. In Sir Purushottam Das Thakur's memorial lecture, Chakravarti said, and I quote, "What is the basic conceptual framework that the committee uses? As I understand it, the committee does assume that there is a reasonable degree of stability in the demand for money in India in a functional sense." Underline the word functional. If this assumption was to be denied, then many recommendations will lose the significance, and it is doubtful with a fairly grossly unstable demand function for money, there is a major role left for the monetary policy itself from the point of view of inflation management. I think it is important to ponder over it. Does monetary policy depend upon a stable demand function for money? On monetary targeting, Sukumar said, and I quote again, "Even granting that the approach of the committee represents an acceptable solution to the problems of regulating monetary expansion, the recommendations of the committee in regard to monetary targeting have occasioned fears that the monetary authority will gain an unintended control over the scale of public expenditures. This impression needs to be dispelled. The phrase monetary targeting is not necessarily to be equated with rigid targets. only a pure monetarist might view monetary targeting as being nothing other than an inflexible rule. What the committee had advocated is monetary targeting with feedback. It has taken care to specify several qualifications to the monetary target as might be derived from the demand for money function or a more comprehensive econometric model, providing for a study of the relationship between money, output and prices on the one hand, and between credit and output on the other. Keeping in view the limitations of empirical investigations of economic phenomena in the context of policy-induced structural changes and strong exogenous supply, institutional and other shocks, the committee has taken as its starting point expansion of M3 within a targeted range rather than a precise targeted increase. Further, the committee, I'm still quoting from Chakravarti, further the committee visualizes that the range will be computed each year. These are major departures from the rigid monetary targeting or from an inflexible money supply growth rate. A clear appreciation of the feature of monetary targeting recommended by the committee is central to the correct interpretation of the committee's recommendations, some of which may look somewhat outdated today. But the fact of the matter is, the 1980s saw in India a very high level of inflation. And the 1980s also resulted finally in the crisis of 91-92. It is in that particular context you should see the recommendations of the Chakravarti committee, which said regulate the money supply consistent with the expected real rate of growth of the economy. It also underlined the fact that at that particular time, the Reserve Bank of India had no absolute control even over the regulation of money supply. The system of issue ad hoc treasury bills almost automatically monetized the fiscal deficit. Therefore, one of the recommendations of the Chakravarti committee was also that the government and the Reserve Bank should agree amongst themselves on what is the appropriate increase in money supply, once again consistent with the real growth of the economy. It is important to note that the recommendation of the Chakravarti committee is very different from what Friedman advocated. Friedman wrote, and I quote from Friedman, changes in the quantity of money which are erratic mean that the economy will be subject to a great deal of uncertainty and will have a very erratic pattern of behavior. And that is why those of us who are called monetarists have always believed that it is very desirable to have a steady rate of monetary growth and not to have erratic or highly erratic. So what Milton Friedman wrote was that there should be a steady rate of growth in money supply, and that will reduce one's uncertainty in the system. I mean, it's almost taking away the discretion to the monetary authority. And that is why Chakravarti and I have in many places pointed out how the recommendations of that committee are totally different from what Friedman was talking about. Friedman was talking about irrespective of any rate of growth of the economy, there will be one rate of growth in money supply. But whereas the Chakravarti committee recommendation, of which I played a significant role in the committee, said regulate money supply but be consistent with the increase in real growth, and also a level of price stability. Much water has flown under the bridge, as they say, since the Chakravarti Committee submitted its report. 1991 saw dramatic changes in India's financial and monetary system. The fiscal dominance has come down a bit. Automatic monetization of fiscal deficit has gone. Administered structure of interest rate has been withdrawn. Government borrows from the market at market determined rates of interest. This has made possible the use of interest rate as a policy variable. I think people sometimes do not realize how much the changes that were introduced in the early 1990s have fundamentally altered the way in which the central bank functions. So long as there was an administered structure of interest rate, there is very little scope as far as the Reserve Bank of India was concerned to modify the rate of interest as a policy variable. More importantly, open market operations could not be conducted because the rates of interest on government bonds were also determined through and kept low because of the high statutory liquidity ratio. These changes, dismantling of the administrative structure of interest, and more importantly, compelling the government to go to the market and raise funds at market determined rates of interest, have completely altered the character of the central bank and the way in which it functions. Is using monetary target justifiable? It is justifiable in some ways. I think I want to quote Mishkin, who said, and I quote from him, using an intermediate target such as money growth is acceptable in an optimal control framework only if the intermediate target contains all information relevant to forecasting the goal variable. In this extreme case, using the intermediate target is equivalent to targeting the forecast of the goal variable. The point that I want to say is, some people think that post 1997 or 98, there were multiple indicators and the approach was different. That is not a correct interpretation. Multiple indicators were always there. What happened post 1998 was, while prior to 1998, a money supply was a target variable or the variable that was manipulated, post 1998, interest rate became a variable which can be manipulated or altered in order to send out the signals of the Reserve Bank of India. What has happened is a shift from quantity to price, and not so much in terms of the multiple objectives or the concerns of the Reserve Bank. The concerns of the Reserve Bank remain the same, but the target variable to be used shifted from money supply to interest rate, and that is precisely because of the dismantling of the administrative structure of interest rate. In the absence of that, interest rate would not have emerged as a policy variable. I'm also going to talk today a little about the new monetary policy framework. You have listened this morning to a detailed lecture on the role of what you might call the inflation target, threshold level of inflation, and what it means for monetary policy. Had I known that Ravindra was going to talk about this, I could have changed the topic this morning. But neither was he aware, nor was I aware. Therefore, I was thinking when we were having tea whether I should change the topic at least at this time. But I think it's too late to do it. And therefore, I will continue with what I have written, but only add where I agree with him or where I differ from him. In any monetary policy framework, a key ingredient is the enunciation of its objectives. as its actions are guided by foremost by objectives. A recurring question in this context is whether all the goals of economic policy are the goals of monetary policy. The issue of objective has become important because of the need to provide a clear guidance to monetary policy makers. Indeed, this aspect has assumed greater importance in the context of the increasing stress on the autonomy of central banks. Autonomy goes with accountability, and accountability goes with a clear enunciation of goals or objectives. Thus, an accountable central bank is one with clearly articulated and publicly stated objectives. You may see where I am leading to. Unless the objective is stated very clearly, then you can't hold the central bank responsible. If you give them multiple objectives, then it is always possible to say, I looked at that objective and promoted it, and if some other objective is not satisfied, then it's not bad. So, in talking of the objectives of monetary policy, I said in 1997, and I quote myself, in a broad sense, the objectives of monetary policy can be no different from the overall objectives of economic policy. The broad objectives of monetary policy in India have been: 1, to maintain a reasonable degree of price stability, and 2, to help accelerate the rate of economic growth. The emphasis as between the two objectives has changed from year to year depending upon the conditions prevailing in that year or in the previous years. The quotation ends. In fact, what I had said was a version of the Taylor's rule in its most discretionary form. The choice of a dominant objective arises essentially because of the multiplicity of objectives and inherent conflict among the objectives. Faced with multiple objectives that are equally relevant and desirable, there is always a problem of assigning to each instrument the most appropriate objective. This is what is called in the policy literature as the assignment rule. This assignment rule favors monetary policy as the most appropriate instrument to achieve the objective of price stability. The fundamental reason to adopt price stability as the dominant objective is that inflation is economically and socially costly. While attempts have been made to estimate the economic costs, the social costs are difficult to estimate. Quite clearly, inflation hits harder the poor than the rich. Of course, I need to underline this in the light of Dolake's speech in the morning. Of course, policy makers also need to take into account the cost of output loss flowing from a disinflationary policy. Yes, there are two sides to it, you need to balance it. But certainly, it is very important to understand the cost of inflation very much. So the whole question is there a trade-off between growth and stability, price stability? The critical issue is this. And the other question is, does the concern of the monetary authority to maintain price stability undermines the objective of faster economic growth? A considerable part of the relevant research effort, to which Ravindra also mentioned in the morning, has been devoted to the trade-off between economic growth and price stability. Empirical evidence on this relationship between growth and inflation in a cross-country framework is somewhat inconclusive, because such studies include countries with an inflation rate as low as 1 to 2% to those with inflation rates ranging beyond 200 to 300%. There are a number of studies which have been done. They take the growth rate of different countries over a period of time because of the long period issue and the inflation rate and do it. But I have not been very impressed by such studies because these range, as I said, from very low inflation to very high inflation. These studies, however, clearly show that growth rates become increasingly adverse at higher rates of inflation. The trade-off between price stability and economic growth has also been discussed in the framework of labor and output markets. The well-known Phillips curve postulated an inverse relationship between unemployment and wage rates. Several economists have challenged the basic microfinance underpinning of the wage and price mechanism that leads to the possibility of trade-off between inflation and growth. I think here there is a view that is expressed that there is a difference between the short term and the long term. Milton Friedman and his colleagues say, yes, there is a short-term trade-off between inflation and growth. But in the long run, it is vertical. Now, this is very much discussed. As what Milton Friedman meant, and later on taken up by Lucas and others, is that it is not the increase in the wage rate which is responsible for the unemployment coming down, but it is the unanticipated increase which is responsible. And therefore, what is relevant is the wage rate minus the rate, the expectation rate or the expected price inflation. And therefore, writes Milton Friedman, to quote him again, as people adjust their expectations of inflation, the short-term Phillips curve will shift upwards and the final resting place would be on that short-term Phillips curve at which the anticipated rate of inflation equals to current rate. Basically, it goes to a proposition which Friedman and his colleagues hold, namely in the long run, the rate of unemployment, therefore we can shift it to growth rate also, is dependent upon other factors. You can talk of this as the neutrality of money, in the sense that ultimately it rests at the level at which what he describes as the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, from that point of view, there's a short-term trade-off, but you should not exploit the short-term trade-off, and the long-run implications of the short-term actions need to be kept in view. There is also an argument that is going on in the developing countries whether the short-term Phillips curve has become flatter. Now, if you look at the Phillips curve, which is the downward sloping, and if this Phillips curve becomes flatter towards the end, it really means that the monetary authority has much greater freedom to be able to use the policy to reduce the unemployment, because the reduction in the unemployment will not cause that much change in the price level. In resolving the short-term trade-off between price stability and output growth in the industrial countries, the solution is sought through the adoption of Taylor's rule. Now, many of the people use the word Taylor's rule. Actually, when Taylor wrote the first article, he did not think of it as a rule. He actually wrote it as a description of what the Federal Reserve was doing. He had the record of the Federal Reserve's operations and looked at it and said, what kind of a formulation would fit in with what they have done? Now, later on, it has been converted into a rule. Now, in the paper I have written a lot. I will skip it, and I will only summarize by saying that the Taylor's rule has two parts. One is when inflation is running at a level higher than what is considered to be desirable. Second, when the output is below or above the potential rate of growth of the economy. The argument is that if the inflation rate, actual inflation rate, is running above the desired rate, then the policy rate should be raised. Similarly, when the actual rate of growth is above the potential rate of growth, the policy rate also should be increased. Or the converse is true. And originally, there are 2 or 3 complicated things in this. One is, what are the coefficients attached to the difference between the potential rate of growth and the actual rate of growth, between inflation rate and the desired inflation level. In the original article, Taylor has used the same coefficient, 0.5 for both. Later, he had to change, but that is what he did. Therefore, much depends critically on that coefficient. Second, raises the other difficult question. What is the potential rate of growth of the economy? In determining the potential rate of growth of the economy, there could be many differences. And then comes even more difficult, what is the desired level of inflation? The desired level of inflation, or not desired, the acceptable level of inflation, is something that on which there could be considerable amount of difference of opinion. As Ravindra told in the morning, perhaps the acceptable level of inflation itself is a function of many other things, and therefore you cannot uniquely say that is the acceptable level of inflation. But Taylor and many other policymakers in the world think that there is a certain desirable level of inflation, which may be derived from the past levels of inflation and the past levels of growth, and that should be the fixed at the desired level of inflation. Now, what is the problem in using Taylor's rule? The problem in using the Taylor's rule, as I mentioned, is a coefficient attached to the 2 different parts in determining the desired level of or the acceptable level of inflation and the potential rate of growth. More importantly, the problem is what happens when the acceptable when the inflation rate is running above the acceptable level of inflation and the rate of growth is running below the potential rate of growth. In the first case, that is in the first part, it says that if inflation is running above the acceptable level, then you have to raise the policy rate. The authorities have to raise the policy rate. But if simultaneously the growth rate is below the potential rate of growth, the authorities will have to lower the rate of the policy rate. Now what do you do? Now this is the opposite of what people used to say, stagflation also. So this is a kind of a situation which is posed many times, and then the coefficients will matter very much. If the coefficient of one is higher than the coefficient of the other, then you will get one result. Therefore, the Taylor's rule, though acceptable in a broad sense, has difficulty in being implemented, but it has a greater degree of, anyway, the acceptance in many of the countries. This actually takes us to the controversial question of the threshold level of inflation. Because unless you have the concept of threshold level of inflation, all this question about whether current inflation is running above the acceptable level becomes meaningless. In fact, in India, I started first using the term threshold level of inflation when I was governor. Because prior to my period, the discussions were essentially on growth, basically what people were talking about was we need to have a higher rate of growth of the economy, and therefore the planning commission desired a certain rate of growth and so on and so forth. And actually matters relating to finance and money were ignored, and we had bouts of inflation in between. I think we must accept it. I think the idea that somehow we can buy growth with inflation is also a very wrong concept. I think it does not. And whether one is a cause is also not very easy to decipher. Therefore, the concept of a threshold level of inflation we started talking about in the early 1990s. And the concept is fairly simple. The concept is threshold level of inflation, a level beyond which costs of inflation begin to rise steeply and affect growth. So basically, when growth rate gets to be adverse above that level of inflation, and that is called the threshold level of inflation. It is this inflation threshold which will provide some guidance to the policy makers. Below and around this threshold level of inflation, there is greater maneuverability for the policy makers to take into account other considerations. Please remember this. It is not as if inflation targeting or going for a particular inflation target means that other considerations are ignored. I will come back to it. That is not true at all. What it really means is that below the threshold level of inflation, it is open to the monetary authorities as well as other authorities to adopt policies which are intended to promote other objectives, more prominently the growth rate. Below and around this threshold level of inflation, there is greater maneuverability. Interestingly, since we are talking so much about 4%, interestingly, the Chakravarti Committee regarded the acceptable rise in prices as 4%. We can also ask what is the empirical evidence on the basis of which this 4% was arrived at. There is no strong econometric modeling that was done to get this particular number. In fact, we were arguing at that time why 0 is not desirable. 0 is not desirable because, let me quote the committee, will reflect changes in relative prices necessary to attract resources to growth sectors. This is something very similar to what Erkov or somebody had said in the 90s paper. So this is really the problem, that price stability did not mean 0. Price stability meant allowing prices to rise to a certain extent which are necessary to facilitate the growth. I had estimated in the Indian context the inflation rate should not exceed 6% if we had avoid adverse consequences, whether I will not take your time much here, but I hope when the paper is distributed, it will have an annexure in which there are 3 models which are put there. And we estimate the first 2 models, actually the results were presented by me in the Indian Econometric Conference, the Golden Jubilee Conference in Bombay. Now, there is a great deal to be said in favor of having an econometric model from which you derive what the threshold level of inflation is. But that also depends upon the quality of that econometric model and the kind of variables that you put in. And I can tell you, if there are differences of opinion on the basis of the reduced form equation estimation, there will be even more differences of opinion on the equations that are forming part of the econometric model. In model 1, we use a model where the inflation itself captures the non-linearity. The annual GDP growth is regressed on inflation, square of inflation, and growth in gross domestic capital formation. And then perhaps at various levels of inflation, the growth rate is estimated, and then you can get a point of inflection, which can be determined as the threshold level of inflation. The second model attributed to second model is by Khan and Sendolji, that where the dummy variable is used, and the dummy variable represents the inflation, and for different levels of inflation the estimated growth rate is done, and then you can find out at what rate of inflation the residual sum of is reduced, and therefore that can also be done. And the third one, which we have done recently, for which I am thankful to my colleague Professor K.R. Shanmugam, who will be here on the third day of the conference, where it is what is called the piecewise regression, assuming that there are different regions, and in each region there is a particular level of inflation, and then you can estimate what it is. Therefore, at what level it becomes adverse. That is, in region A, the rate of growth is and the inflation configuration is 1, and in the region 2, the configuration between inflation and the rate of growth is different. From this we can find out, and in fact this piecewise regression is done not only in relation to inflation things, but also for many other areas. What is the net result of that? By a strange coincidence, the result that I get is 6.58%. In the sense that the really the adverse effect on growth happens somewhere around that figure, somewhere between 6 and 7%. When the inflation touches, there is definitely an adversity on growth. I really wanted to try and see whether we can get closer to the monetary policy framework mandate, 4 plus or minus 2%. I am not succeeded. I mean, I think at 4% it doesn't. And there is no way of saying at 4% there is an adverse impact on growth. But certainly from 4% onwards, when you find the relationship between the two, it keeps on decreasing, it keeps on increasing, and at 6.58 it definitely has an impact on growth. Whether this goes to support Ravindra or not, I don't know, but this is what it essentially emerges. Now there is a great deal of argument about whether in these matters you have a very complicated econometric model or you do it with a reduced form equation. When we were students at the University of Pennsylvania, on the first floor, or the Professor Klein used to sit, on the ground floor, Professor Irving Friend used to sit. So they always said there is a conflict between the ground floor and the first floor. Because the ground floor always felt that the less the number of equations, it is better. Whereas the first floor always believed the larger the better. So the students' view depended upon whether they were on the ground floor or on the first floor. So while I am and I was a student of Klein, and therefore a natural preference for econometric models, but certainly in some of these cases I think the reduced form equation helps because you must have an idea. I mean, I personally think monetary authority will be in wilderness if you really say that it can be this, it can be that, it can be something else. Then I think it becomes extremely difficult to navigate monetary policy. Some idea of where and at what point inflation really begins damaging must be had. Then why not? Then have a 10% inflation, 12% inflation. If inflation helps, therefore there is a point at which if inflation goes beyond a point, it will adversely affect growth. It is it's almost like a fiscal deficit. Budget making is no great exercise if there is no constraint to fiscal deficit. You spend, if you cannot raise revenue, make it a fiscal deficit. What is the problem? There is a compulsion that beyond your fiscal deficit level, the economy will suffer. And therefore, I will not go, if that is the impression you draw from Jolakya's speech, that inflation is good, please don't do it. I think inflation, I hope that's not his view, but the point really is that inflation is not something that will always deliver. Inflation has also to be checked in. Otherwise, the first thing we should do is abolish the Reserve Bank of India. And then along with it will go the Monetary Policy Committee also. So therefore, I think there is a point in making making this point that inflation beyond a point is prejudicial. Well, actually, I am at the wrong audience, or I am following a wrong person. The people, when inflation targeting was introduced, the people who attacked it are those who think that there is nothing called an inflation target, we should not do inflation targeting at all. And one has to justify whether there should be inflation targets or not. I will not, I'm taking time, but I will answer 2 or 3 questions that have arisen, which go away from Ravindra's approach. What Ravindra was making this morning. Does inflation targeting mean the exclusion of other objectives? My view is it is not. And my contention is that so long as inflation remains within the comfort zone, the monetary authority has every option to use a policy to promote other objectives. My definition of inflation targeting is it is only when inflation goes beyond the target level, that is the outside limit, then don't bring in other arguments in order to support inflation. That's not correct. Once the actual inflation runs beyond the upper level of the inflation targeting, then the only goal, the only objective of the monetary authority should be to act and control inflation. Below that, full freedom to the monetary authority. Now, whether this will be accepted by others, I do not know. But this is my interpretation. In fact, there are a lot of people, I have quotes from many others, good friend and many others, I will leave them. Let me ask, some people say that the 2008 crisis has run this death knell of inflation targeting. That, I think, is a wrong interpretation. It is not correct to say that inflation targeting has come to an end because of the 2008-9 crisis. I'm talking of the developed countries. The problem there is when the 2008-9 crisis was preceded by great moderation, what should have been the attitude of the monetary authorities? Greenspan mentioned at one time that let the bubble burst, then I will take care. Now, I think is a very wrong approach to policy making. The other is what was happening in the Great Moderation. Consumer price index was coming down. I would think consumer price level was coming down, but asset prices were rising. This raises the question about what prices you look at, whether the consumer price index alone is good enough, or the asset prices also should you look at or not. Therefore, the problem is that when asset prices were rising, the monetary authority has kept quiet. This goes back to the point that I made. So long as the economy is operating within the comfort zone, you should also act on other objectives. And therefore, if they had taken action, perhaps monetary policy could have also helped to avoid the problem, even though there is no consistent view on whether the crisis of 2008-9 was caused by monetary policy failure or supervisory failure. There are many people who have argued, I have some quotes from some of the people, some people who have argued that it is essentially a supervisory function failure rather than monetary policy failure. The monetary policy at best, by keeping the low interest rates, had only helped to be more risk-taking. I think it helped people to take more risk. Therefore, it is a contrary situation in which the monetary policy should have been used in order to control the situation. So, point number one, inflation targeting does not exclude the concern of other objectives. The other objectives can be taken care of well within the when the economy is operating within the comfort zone. The other is point that control of inflation is not independent of the objective of growth. After all, inflation cannot be taught independent of what is happening to the rest of the economy. I would like you to look at the minutes of the Monetary Policy Committee. The Monetary Policy Committee discusses, members discuss about what the future trend of the growth will be, what are the expectations, how it could be affected, and so on. Therefore, it is not correct to say that it is independent of the objective of growth. The Amendment Act of 2016 relating to RBI says, whereas the primary objective of monetary policy is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth. Now one may say this is watered down, but certainly considerations of growth are not outside the realm, and even the behavior of price cannot be forecast without a consideration of what is happening to the growth. The second question is, does the Reserve Bank or any monetary authority have the control over inflation? Assuming that control of inflation at some particular level is desirable for the monetary authority, does it have the control? There are 2 points that are being made. One is exactly the point that in the case of demand control, the monetary authority is very successful. But when it is because of supply shocks, its ability to control inflation is somewhat limited. But it does not mean that because it is originated by supply shocks that monetary authority should not act. Because if there is a food inflation, for example, it gets generalized at the next stage. Because the food inflation goes up, the wage rate goes up, and as a consequence, the overall inflation also goes up. Therefore, it is for this reason, some people argue that why don't you look at core inflation? I have very great difficulty in looking at core inflation. What is this core inflation? In Western countries, Oil, whenever they talk of supply shock, they think of oil actually. It's only in developing countries like India we think of food inflation. There they talk about the impact of oil. Now yes, then you exclude oil, you exclude some other things, then what happens? Then what are you looking at? I think in the final analysis, if inflation has an impact on the economy, it is not just the core inflation. It is a total headline inflation which affects. And therefore you must look at the headline inflation. And I believe that when the supply shocks are there, even then the monetary authority has a role. There is also an asymmetry in the way in which monetary policy works. Monetary policy is more effective in controlling inflation rather than stimulating economy. Many of the people who think that we can lower the rate of interest and therefore economy will get stimulated are oblivious of other factors which have an impact on growth. Therefore the question is that in the case of when inflation rising, when the interest rate is raised, it has an impact and it can be done. But when the economy is at a low ebb, by lowering the rate of interest, you are not able to go to raise the economy. It is Leon Tarshis who said the monetary system is equipped with efficient brakes, but the accelerator is uncertain. So the accelerator of trying to move the economy up is very difficult through monetary policy. It is the same thing as the common saying, you can take the horse to the pond but cannot compel it to drink. You can offer it credit at a lower rate of interest and then it can, but even then, if the horse doesn't drink, you can't control very much. Now, there are one or two things I mentioned and I will close there. I have something on natural rate of interest and so on. I will leave them out. The transmission mechanism is one thing about which the monetary authorities are concerned. And I have two statements to make. The monetary authority bemoans from time to time that the policy rate has been reduced by so much, but the banks have not done it. In the literature, as you know, there are two kinds of lags that they talk about. One is the inside lag, that is the lag between when the central bank raises the bank rate and when the commercial banks raise the other rates. The outside lag is the time taken for a rise in the interest rate to have an impact on the economy. Obviously, everybody knows the outside lag is very high. What happens when the rate of interest goes up and what effect it will have on employment or prices and so on. But the inside lag is small in most countries. In India too, it has been low. But more recently, because of the fact that the banking system is faced with a severe non-performing assets problem, despite lowering of the rate of interest by the central bank, the commercial banks are not inclined to lower the rate of interest. We have to take that into account. But raises the more fundamental question, namely, what does the central bank do in order to make a rise or a fall in the rate of interest stick? In fact, my problem with the Monetary Policy Committee, two members are here, it is misnamed. It is not a Monetary Policy Committee. It is only a rate fixation committee. They walk away after that. And it is, what I am saying is that what kind of liquidity do you infuse, what manner in which you do, all of this is part of the monetary policy. Therefore, simply saying Let me tell you, Reserve Bank of India or any central bank cannot act like King Canute. They cannot say, we are raising the rate, we are lowering the rate, and then everybody follows. No. The central bank has to act in order to make it stick. And how do you act? And it is you can act only through changes in the money supply. In the final analysis, in my view, the choice between quantity and price as a policy variable can be anything. But unless the quantity is also changed, it cannot really bring about a change in price. And therefore, very often I keep on saying that please look at money supply. I'm sorry to say that even the minutes of the Monetary Policy Committee and much more the report of the Reserve Bank of India sometimes does not even mention money supply. I wonder sometimes that have we reached the stage of monetary policy without money? Because it has been thrown into the oblivion. In the final analysis, it is important. Price cannot be affected unless the central banking authority also acts on the quantity. You know, on the rate of interest itself, there is a lot of literature available on whether a change in the rate of interest can affect the economy. There's an old argument, many of you may not have read. Those are the books that we studied as students. That is in the 1950s. Many of you may not have been born. So, the Hartley-Keynes argument. Hartley's argument was that the rate of interest affects the inventory holding, and through that, changes in inventory holding, the consequences follow. According to Keynes, the policy rate influences the long-term rate of interest, and therefore it affects investment. Now, which one is true and which one is more effective? A lot of studies have been done. I think there are much less studies in India on the relationship between rate of interest and the way the economic agents behave. One thing that is very clear, that in terms of long-term borrowing, like housing, where the payment is spread over several decades, the rate of interest is certainly a very decisive influence. That is found in many studies. I will, before closing, I also want to mention that I mentioned that money supply is still a relevant variable. I have estimated in my paper some equations using money supply and reserve money. And I do find, despite all the talks about the policy rate and so on, ultimately the changes in reserve money and monetary policy, money supply do have an effect. I won't read out the equation, I'm running out of time. And let me come to the conclusion. There's an old argument in monetary policy between discretion and rules. Should monetary authorities have a rule or discretion? The most typical example of rule is the gold standard, which said the central authority must expand credit when gold comes in and contract credit when gold goes out. Inflexible rule. Another inflexible rule is what Milton Friedman said. Let the monetary authority allow the money to grow at a fixed rate. So these are rules. And Bernanke says that inflation targeting is not a rule but a framework. He says there is a lot of discretion that is given, and therefore it should not be treated as a rule. We have had only 3 years or 4 years of inflation targeting in our country. It's very difficult to, on the basis of any empirical evidence, to show whether this has been a success or not. Of course, it is true that the inflation rate has remained low during this particular period. And it is also a period in which the oil prices have also been low. So I think that's a very favorable factor which have contributed to it. And food inflation has also been low. So whether the monetary policy framework has led to the lowering of the inflation, I think whether one can assert, it's very unclear. But certainly, what is seen is a lowering of the inflation rate during this period. But then there will be the contrary question to say, that namely, that has it really led to a fall in output? Has the growth rate come down because of monetary policy? You know, it is very difficult to assess the performance of central banks many times. Because even when the direction is clear, the exact point at which the slowing down or the lowering or the raising happens becomes extremely important. It is true in the last 2.5 years or something like that, or at least 2 years, the direction has been in the direction of lowering the policy rate. Whether on occasions they could have done it earlier than what they have done is a particular question that arises. But certainly, I think the blame on the slowing down cannot be put very much on monetary policy. I think the slowing down of the economy, there are many other reasons to look at. And that is the subject for next econometric conference lecture. So I would only conclude by saying, I will read out what I have written. The monetary policy framework adopted by India and many other countries is correctly described as flexible inflation target. Most of these countries set not only an inflation target, but also provide a range within which it can fluctuate. This flexibility is extremely important because it emphasizes the uncertainties against which central banks have to operate. The range implies two things. First, there can be sudden and unexpected supply shocks. This has special implications for developing economies like India, where agriculture is still a significant part of the economy. Advanced countries think mostly in terms of oil when they talk of supply shocks. In fact, some countries, to avoid the impact of supply shocks, took a look at coal inflation, as I mentioned earlier. But supply shocks do have an effect not only on items directly affected, but also on other components in the retail price index. This is particularly true in the case of food inflation in countries like India. On the whole, it is better to deal with the headline inflation with a range than excluding certain items. The range also underlies the fact that there is always a lag between monetary policy decisions and the impact on inflation. The range thus provides flexibility in terms of the time required to bring inflation back to the desired level when it deviates. To conclude, theory is very important in terms of policy. Ultimately, many people who say that they don't use theory are perhaps using theory as Keynes mentioned, or perhaps using a wrong theory. But central banking is also something that comes by looking at past experience and adapting to it. Somebody said, central banking is neither a science nor an art, but a craft. I don't think this is a correct description. Central banking is no longer the case of applying well-known techniques to well-known problems. Neither the problems nor the techniques are very clear. And that is why all central banks need to learn from experience. Thank you very much.
ஸோ வருடத்தில் முதல் மாதம் ஜனவரி. இப்போ நீங்கள் பொருளாதாரத்தை பற்றி தெரிஞ்சுக்கிட்டதில் நிறையா ப்ளஸ் இருக்குன்னு தான் நினைக்கிறேன். அண்ட் இன்னொரு முக்கியமான விஷயம், பொங்கல். எஸ், உங்கள் எல்லாருக்கும் என் இனிய பொங்கல் நல்வாழ்த்துக்கள். பொங்கலோடு சேர்த்து மகிழ்ச்சி, செல்வம் இதெல்லாம் உங்கள் வீட்டில் பொங்கி வரணும்ன்ற வாழ்த்துக்கள். அண்ட் இதோட நம்ம ஷோவோட எண்டுக்கும் வந்தாச்சு. இதே மாதிரி ஒரு நல்ல ஷோவை நீங்கள் நெக்ஸ்ட் வீக் வரை வெயிட் பண்ணி பார்த்து தான் ஆகணும். எஸ், until then signing off, tata bye bye from ஐஸ்வர்யா லோகநாதன். நீங்கள் பார்த்துட்ருக்குது த ஜீனியஸ் சீட்.